Hello, friends, and welcome to the April 16th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about public policy issues here in the great state of Texas and talk about how we can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Outreach Director, and today's episode is being brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. I want to take just a moment to recognize the world that we're living in. Our Jewish and Christian listeners recently celebrated Passover, Holy Week, and Easter, and our Muslim listeners are preparing for Ramadan starting next week. So faith leaders of all traditions are struggling with figuring out how to provide meaningful worship opportunities while also trying to figure out how to respond to needs in our local communities unlike anything we've ever experienced. And in the midst of that, elected officials are trying to figure out what in the world to do. And they need communities of faith and faith leaders talking to them about what you are experiencing in your own communities. So at this moment, we need you to step up in big ways. So Texas Impact is posting action alerts on our coronavirus page on our website. 3 of those went out last week in our e-news, and I expect that we'll have some more coming out very soon. So it's a perfect time to sign up to be a part of our rapid response team or our legislative engagement groups to figure out how you can be the most effective advocate. You can sign up for those on our website at texasimpact.org or email me at scott@texasimpact.org. And we're trying to bring you content related to the crisis, but we also have issues that we need to discuss about other things going on in the world. So today, we're going to have a conversation about religious freedom with 2 Madison Fellows with Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, Sarah Goetz and Patrick Grubel. Also joining us today will be Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Josh Houston, who will help us discuss an amicus brief that we recently joined in with Americans United in Trump versus Pennsylvania. So we're going to talk about that and other religious freedom topics today. And I'll tell y'all, like I had the last couple of weeks, we're all doing this from our homes. And so please excuse any children that walk in or dogs that bark or audio that's not up to our usual standards. But we'll go ahead and jump in. So Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
How are you adjusting to life at home so far?
It's a little chaotic with a 3-year-old and a wife that works full time, but I can't complain. We're both still getting paid, and we're doing a lot better than a lot of Americans right now. So I don't want to complain.
I understand that. Sarah, thanks for joining us. How are you feeling today? You adjusting?
I'm good, and with no children of my own, I'm very sympathetic as I, on Zoom calls with colleagues, hearing the pitter patter of footsteps and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'll just echo Josh to say happy to be healthy and working and speaking with you all.
All right, and Patrick, last but not least, thank you for joining us. How are you adjusting?
Thanks for having me on. It's a weird time, but we're all just doing the best we can.
All right, so I want to start out with maybe the most important question, at least for me. We have 3 people with us today who, looking at your bios, all went to prestigious law schools. And I hear people say this different all the time, so I want y'all's feedback. Is it amicus or amicus? How do we say that word? Somebody's going to help me, right?
It's either. So I don't know. Does that help you or not? I don't know.
I just wanted a solid answer, so I didn't want to make a foolish mistake in front of all my lawyer friends here today.
Never ask a lawyer if you want a solid answer about anything, I would say.
All right. So this is off to a hot start. For those who can't see, the other 2 are laughing at me right now. So more importantly, Josh, to say that you are passionate about religious freedom issues, I think would be an understatement. And you've talked on Weekly Witness many times about this topic. But we're going to be talking later in this episode about Texas Impact and the Texas Interfaith Center for Public Policy joining in the amicus brief on Trump versus Pennsylvania. But before we get into the specifics, can you remind our listeners about Texas Impact's 3 principles that make up our religious freedom framework?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to have some of our national friends with us today. We, of course, primarily do our advocacy at the state level and in the legislative and executive branches. We just don't have resources to do a whole lot of judicial. We don't litigate for Americans United that enable us to keep up with impact litigation that's going on, participate in amicus briefs, and very grateful that someone's doing the impact litigation from a viewpoint we agree with. It's kind of a David and model in some ways right now. So yeah, whenever we have a bill, and we have a lot of them in Texas, about 20 to 25, sometimes as many as 40 in a legislative session that touches or affects religion, we have kind of principles that we which you can find in our publication, Equal Liberty. It's all over our website, but I'll just remind everybody that principle number 1, government must not prefer or disadvantage one faith relative to another, and that includes those of all. 2, government must not force against conscience unless, and this is coming up a lot these days, unless there's a state interest that compels it. And 3, government must not permit adherents of one faith to harm non-adherents as an expression of faith. And these are new ideas at all. They're what I think we call traditional American religious liberty, which is the 3 principles of the Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and the traditional meaning of religious liberty in America. They come from a viewpoint that the Free Exercise Clause is very large, the Establishment Clause is very minimal, and they do not really care about affecting third parties. That is not how the First Amendment is written. There are 2 co-equal clauses, the Disestablishment and Free Exercise Clauses. And we think that both are equally important religious liberty protections. Without free exercise, you risk a state that can prohibit religion. And without disestablishment, you risk a theocracy. So most of what we're going to talk about today and what I'm looking forward to hearing about, and frankly, it's where most of the conversation is going to be for the next decade, at least given the makeup of our judiciary, is the erosion of the Establishment Clause, or what we'll often refer to as separation of church and state. Those of you who have ever heard me talk before have heard me say that separation of church is a hostility to religion. But it was created by and for religious people. It was long advocated for by religious minorities present in America to protect minorities from religious majorities. And so for people of faith, it's of critical importance that we really recommit and rediscover our roots and our advocacy for separation of religion from civil government.
So thank you, Josh. And I want to bring in our Americans United friends to the conversation. Before the virus, we were already planning for a blockbuster term at the United States Supreme Court. There were a number of executive actions, and that was before COVID-19. So when we first talked about doing this podcast, we wanted to talk about the amicus that we joined in Trump versus Pennsylvania. But before we get to that, we should probably talk about a few COVID-19 related issues. So first up, the stay-at-home orders. Texas Impact has a list of denominational statements from faith leaders encouraging members to move services online and to not meet in person. But other irresponsible pastors, and I guess I'm being pejorative there, I'll own that, are claiming that those stay-at-home orders violate their rights. So I wonder how we should see those cases.
So Americans United has been filing some amicus briefs, I'll say amicus, in cases like this, including in Texas, actually. And we focus on the exact same principles that Josh mentioned at the top, that these orders, at least the ones that we're seeing, don't discriminate between religious denominations. They apply to everybody equally. They say no gatherings of 10 people, or you can only leave your home for these limited essential purposes, but they're not playing favorites. And then we say it's an important interest. We're seeing that the COVID COVID-19 disease is dangerous. It spreads from people being in close contact with each other who might not even know that they're infected at the time. And the only way to really prevent the transmission is to tell people not to get together. And that's, for religious worship, for book clubs, any kind of gathering, it doesn't matter. The virus can spread in all of them. So it's important that the orders apply to everybody. And so that's the religious exercise side of it. And then there's the Establishment Clause side that says, if we give special exemptions for religious groups and everybody else in danger potentially, because it's not just that congregation that might be exposed, but then it's everybody that they go and talk to. And then that would be a religious preference in a way that might harm other people.
We appreciate you all doing the legal work on that. And I certainly appreciate all the faith leaders who are speaking out on this, and would just, again, encourage people to encourage your clergy, to encourage your congregations to worship from home for now. Another issue that has come up relates to the PPP, or the small business loans that churches are eligible for. And so I guess the question is, are there instances in U.S. history where we've allowed taxpayer dollars to go to clergy? And what are you seeing the issues in terms of this set of cases?
So I'm not aware of any examples of that happening. And actually, if you go back to the founding era, before the First Amendment was even ratified, you'd see that there were debates about this, and there was strong opposition to essentially forcing people to pay for religious activities, specifically forcing them to fund the salaries of ministers. And so it's actually a long tradition of the opposite of forbidding that kind of thing. And the real, the crux of it is that there's nothing more religious than being a minister, right? So even if you might be able to pay a religious organization to provide foster care services, that's a secular service. Paying for a minister is inherently religious.
All right. So in relation to the SBA loans that are going out right now, are you aware of any safeguards to ensure that the loans are not only being awarded to, for example, evangelical Christian organizations while discriminating against Muslims or other mainline Protestants? I'm not aware of anything. Ostensibly they're available to everybody on their face. The rules don't discriminate, but that is always a risk in this sort of thing, that it, even if it's not intentional, it could end up being that way, favoring the majority. Josh, Sarah, anything y'all would add to the COVID-19 related situation we find ourselves in before we move on to the court cases?
No. Let's go ahead and move on to the Supreme Court cases. I think that was pretty good. I think it's going to be interesting to see how those loans get awarded, and the implementation is worthy of being watched.
So we'll continue to keep an eye on that and let you know if there's anything else that listeners should be paying attention to. But let's move on. Enough COVID-19 fun for now. I'm sure we'll talk more about it a lot in the weeks to come. But let's transition to kind of 4 sets of Supreme Court cases that we want to highlight for today. And first up is Trump v. Pennsylvania. What are the basics of this case, and what should people know?
Sure. So this is the latest iteration, basically, of the battle over the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. So if you'll permit me a little history, I'll try to be brief. But basically, the Women's Health Amendment to the ACA requires health insurance plans to cover preventive care, and that includes contraceptive coverage. Under the Obama administration, which initially implemented the ACA, houses of worship, so churches, other houses of worship, were exempted from the requirement. and religious nonprofit organizations were entitled to an accommodation. And the accommodation was basically if they had religious objections to carrying insurance plans that provided contraceptive coverage to their employees, they just had to notify the government, and that way the government could fulfill the ACA's mandate through other means so that there was no cost sharing for women who wanted contraceptive coverage. A Supreme Court case a few years ago, Hobby Lobby v. Burwell, extended that accommodation to for-profit, closely held companies. So the lay of the land then was that religious nonprofit organizations, as well as closely held companies who had religious objections, could just had to notify the government that they didn't want to carry these plans, and the government could fulfill the ACA's mandate through other means. The crux of the Hobby Lobby decision was basically that the Supreme Court found that, yes, it burdened the religious exercise of employers who didn't want to provide the coverage, and so they were entitled to that accommodation. So that sort of brings us to the present dispute, which is basically the Trump administration didn't accept that sort of balancing approach that the previous administration had taken. The Trump administration claimed that even the accommodation itself, the notification requirement, was itself a violation of employers' religious freedom. And so they proposed rules that would make that accommodation process, the notification process, actually optional. So that the way that the Trump administration would have it, not only could employers elect not to carry insurance plans that covered contraceptive care, but they didn't even have to tell the government. And the problem with that is that the government then has no way of knowing that there are employees, and we're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands of people potentially, who don't have access to contraceptive care at no cost. So several states sued. The case is now at the Supreme Court, and the question really is whether the accommodation process, the notification process, is permissible, or whether it violates employers' religious exercise to require them to do this sort of bare minimum thing of notifying the government of their refusal to provide the coverage themselves.
And so Americans United filed a brief, an amicus brief in this case. What's the argument in the brief?
Sure. So the argument is basically, yes, the government may sometimes grant religious exemptions and accommodations, but there are two very important restrictions. One, anytime the government grants an accommodation, it must be alleviating an actual and a substantial burden on religious exercise. There has to be a substantial burden on religious exercise before the government can exempt or accommodate an employer. And the second important principle is that whatever accommodation the government does grant, it can't harm third parties in the process. So it can't, in granting person A an exemption, offset that by casting harms to person B. And if either of those two principles isn't present, it's the government kind of putting its thumb and favoring the religious beliefs of the employer over others. And the Establishment Clause doesn't allow that. So that's sort of the lay of the land. And our position is that in this case, the present system, the notification requirement, it's not actually a burden on religion, that it's basically the sort of bare minimum requirement that we need to kind of have a functioning rule of law. And And I do want to just sort of stop and be very clear that we're not saying that a religious employer is right or wrong to think or believe what they believe about contraceptive care, or even about, the degree to which they're complicit in providing coverage, in the note of, in giving notice. It's not about making a value judgment of any sort about whether that belief is right or wrong. It's that when it comes to the law, there has to be sort of an objective, a legal test to make determine about whether there's a substantial burden. Otherwise, sort of you have a system where everyone is entitled to kind of create their own law. And the other really important point that we made in our brief is that doing away with the notification requirement would cast significant and really serious harms onto women. So contraceptive care is important health care, not just to prevent pregnancy, but for a wide variety of medical conditions. But it's expensive, and there are lots of studies showing that even sort of small impediments to obtaining coverage can basically be the difference between getting it or not. So in other words, a copay. And that it violates the Establishment Clause to have a system where women would be harmed by not getting contraceptive coverage at no cost, to which they should be entitled.
Thanks. So you can find the brief and some brief comments from Josh on it on our website, texasimpact.org. Should be on the front page right now, or you can just search Texas Impact amicus. Josh, I wonder if you could add some comments about why you think it's important that we, as an organization that represents adjudicatories or denominational members, think it's important to sign on to this brief.
Yeah, I want to add a Texas-specific example to this. The issue of a religious contractor or religious employer providing notice, it sounds kind of wonky, but I want to make a couple points. One, this is not just about contraception and abortion. We had a bill in Texas in 2017 that was House Bill 3859. It is now law. It pertained to child welfare providers, so adoption, foster care. And it did not just apply to a religious provider's, contractor's beliefs about LGBT. It just apply. It would apply to any religious belief. So, for example, and this was actually an example of our Attorney General when his representative testified before the committee. A religious provider and the religious provider not have to immunize the child. When that bill hit the House floor, we tried to push an amendment that required the provision of notice to the caseworker when the provider does not provide a otherwise contracted for service like immunizing the child. And both chambers, the House and Senate, rejected the amendments that notice be provided. So here's where the risk parties is not just a theoretical risk. It is not incorrect to say that what the Texas legislature told 3-year-old foster care children in its care is, it's your responsibility, 3-year-old, to tell the caseworker that you weren't immunized. We're not going to put any burden on the religious contractor to at least give us notice of the children in our custody. And that's just absolutely absurd. The provider's rights that are being paid with taxpayer dollars in many cases prevail over the rights of the beneficiary. In this case, is a 3 or 5-year-old child. And that's absurd. And an actual example of actually legally possible.
So anything else listeners should or do need to know about Trump v. Pennsylvania? Or do we have any idea of what the timeline might be on this moving forward?
Well, so the court will hear oral argument by telephone, I think, which is going to be a first for the Supreme Court in sometime in May. And then, a decision presumably coming the following month. That's about the timeline.
All right. Anything else we need to know on that one?
I don't think so. Not from my perspective.
Now let's talk Espinoza.
Let's talk Espinoza. So next up is Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue. So Sarah, can you walk us through that case?
Sure. So this is a school voucher case out of Montana. Basically, the Montana legislature passed a tax credit program, which is kind of similar to a voucher program that allowed taxpayers to get a dollar-for-dollar tax credit up to a certain amount for donations that they make to scholarship organizations, which then donated the money to pay for students' private school tuition. The program designed by Montana's legislature allowed these funds to be used at secular or religious private schools. In practice, most of the money was used to fund religious education. The sort of hitch there is that Montana's state constitution, along with something like 37 other states, actually prohibits the use of taxpayer funds to support religion. And Montana's constitution specifically speaks to prohibiting taxpayer funds for religious education. So in recognition of that, Montana's tax department issued a rule construing the program to be limited to secular private education only to come into compliance with Montana's own constitution. And several parents who did or wanted to send their children to private religious schools sued, arguing that it was religious discrimination to cabin the program to just secular schools. So the case went up through the Montana state courts. The Montana Supreme Court actually struck down the whole program as to everyone, so that where things stand now is that the program doesn't exist. No one is getting money, whether secular or religious. And despite that outcome at the Montana Supreme Court, the parents pursued review by the U.S. Supreme Court, which has agreed to hear the case and is basically now poised to decide whether states are allowed, whether states are permitted to fund secular education, but not religious education. So in other words, whether every time a state wants to sort of protect its citizens' anti-establishment interests and religious freedom by not allowing taxpayer funds to be used to go to religious education or to put to other religious purposes, whether states are allowed to do that, or whether they must, every time they're funding secular education, also fund religious education.
So this has the potential to moving down to state courts? Think what happens?
Well, yeah, I mean, Texas has Article 1, Section 7 in our Constitution. It's the exact same law as Montana's, which is prohibiting exactly this thing. The real question is, can states continue to do that, or is the Supreme Court going to preempt that? I should add that on our website you can find this. We also signed on to an amicus brief in this case that Americans United filed and wrote and filed as well, and you can find it. It was several months ago, and we've all slept since then. I wanted to make sure that if you Google Texas impact and Espinoza, you'll probably find it pretty easy.
All right. Anything else to add on that one?
I would just add one other thing, which is sort of that, and kind of Patrick alluded to this earlier a little bit, talking about the COVID stuff, but the anti-establishment interests that states have in not allowing taxpayer funds to be put to religious uses are very long-standing. They go back to the founding. They go back to the very things that prompted passage of the First Amendment. And the other point is that you can see in the writings of Madison and Jefferson, going way back, that this point is about not just protecting the conscience of taxpayers who don't want their money to be used to fund religion, but it's also about protecting religious institutions, protecting the sanctity and autonomy of religious bodies, and sort of their interest in not letting the government have its hand in religion as much as not wanting religious uses of taxpayer funds. So it sort of is duly important and protective. So we'll see what the court does with that. But
and similar timeline there, or what are we looking at?
The Supreme Court heard oral argument on that case in January. So it's conceivable that we'll get a ruling very soon. And sometime within the next month or so, we should have a ruling.
All right, so watch this space. So next up, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to thank.
All right, Josh just froze, so I'm going to keep
Establishment. Okay.
Go ahead. You froze for a second. Go ahead.
I was in the struggle for anti-establishment predates the Constitution and postdates the Constitution. It was largely fought out in the states for about 2 decades before and 2 decades, 3-4 decades after, actually, until every state disestablished. And so for even the most originalist justice, they ought, if they're true to the so-called philosophy, ought to at least take that into the history into account. So that'll be interesting to see how it comes out.
We will be watching. Next up, we have a couple of cases, or a couple of cases related to the Civil Rights Act, specifically talking about the ministerial exemption. So I wonder if you could walk us through those next two on our outline, Sarah.
Sure, of course. So there are a couple of cases. Basically, in both cases, grade school teachers at Catholic schools were fired. They alleged they were fired for unlawful reasons. One of the teachers brought suit under the ADA, claiming she was fired for having breast cancer and having missed work to receive treatment. The other teacher in the other case brought an age discrimination claim under the federal ADEA. I'm forgetting what the acronym precisely is, but so the schools, in defending against these lawsuits, relied on a constitutional principle known as the ministerial exception, which basically says that the Constitution forbids government from getting involved in the internal workings of and governance of religious bodies. So the government can't have a say in the hiring and firing of religious leaders, ministers. And that means that otherwise generally applicable anti-discrimination laws don't apply when we're talking about a ministerial employee of a religious institution. So the question before the court in these cases is whether these grade school teachers qualify as ministers and therefore are not entitled to bring employment discrimination lawsuits. So, the kind of sticking point is, some applications of this point are sort of obvious. A priest, a rabbi, what have you, these are pretty clearly religious leaders. These cases are tougher. So the Supreme Court has it's ruled on this issue, I think just one time ever. And it held that a grade school teacher can be a minister. In the case it decided, the teacher, her title was something like ministerial teacher or something like that. She had a number of important religious leadership functions in her school. led worship activities, exercised all kinds of spiritual guidance. She obtained some kind of tax benefits that are attached to being a minister. And the court said, looking at all the facts, that's enough. She's a minister. She is not able to assert an employment discrimination case. The schools are protected. These cases now are a little softer. The facts are a little different in each one. In both cases, the teachers, they have some religious duties. In the one, the teacher organized a religious service a couple times a semester. I think in both cases, the teachers were required they taught religion a certain number of times per week, but they were just reading from the book or what have you. They monitored students during prayer and took them to church services, but weren't actually leading them. So it's a little thorny, and that's what the Supreme Court is sort of poised to decide, basically how broad this ministerial exception is. Again, there are millions, I think, of employees of religious institutions, maybe just religious schools alone. And so you can see that a big sweeping ruling by the Supreme Court could exempt huge swaths of people, could do away with protections, anti-discrimination protections that they otherwise would have. And, you could see maybe these cases are a little muddier, but then, what if we're talking about the gym teacher, the coach, the custodian, the receptionist, sort of those things are potentially on the table if we have an overly broad outcome here. So,
Josh, I'm having some real flashbacks to the Texas legislature listening to her talk right now. Anything that you can point us to there?
I actually had more of a question. Stay tuned for Texas specific. I'm sure we're going to have legislation based on however this case comes out. Should we make anything of the fact that the Supreme Court took up the Civil Rights Act cases to sexual orientation in the Civil Rights Act, and then subsequently granted cert on 2 of these ministerial exception cases? Is there anything for cultures or is there any white smoke we should be looking for?
Yeah. Well, I'm historically not good at reading the tea leaves, but I think you're right to connect the dots there. I don't know if this is what you're thinking of. Potentially, the LGBTQ community gets a great win if the Supreme Court says that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that sex discrimination extends to orientation and gender identity, and then on the heels of that, which will be a great win, if we do get it, on the heels of that, you might then have the court saying, but wait, there are all kinds of exemptions for religious institutions, for ministerial employees, to kind of undercut protections that are broadcloth that LGBTQ employees get, but then are kind of undercut elsewhere. So I don't know if that's what you're thinking of, but maybe so.
Anything down there, Josh?
No, let's move on.
All right. So finally, Fulton v. City of Philadelphia. Explain that to us, and what should we be watching for?
Sure. So the City of Philadelphia contracts out, pays and licenses private foster care agencies, including faith-based agencies, to carry out services on behalf of the city. So they review certified potential foster parents. They place children in homes. The city of Philadelphia stopped partnering with certain faith-based agencies when it learned that they were refusing to provide foster care services to same-sex couples who wanted to become foster parents. So the city itself has an anti-discrimination ordinance that extends to orientation. It told the entities that if they didn't comport with that anti-discrimination law, that it would stop partnering with them. One of the agencies sued the city, arguing that it amounted to religious discrimination against the faith-based agencies to refuse to partner with them because their motivation for refusing services to same-sex couples was based on their religious beliefs. So now that case has made its way to the Supreme Court, which will decide potentially whether governments are allowed to fund and contract with private agencies that offer services on a discriminatory basis, when they're offering governmental services that are paid for with taxpayer dollars. And potentially the court will decide whether, in fact, governments not only may, but must fund and contract with them when they are doing so with secular organizations. So potentially some big rulings on that front coming down the pike. And I would just say, and then I'll shut up, that really this case is not about doing business with faith-based social service providers. I think there are pretty long-standing partnerships between government and faith-based organizations providing social services. That's allowed. That happens all the time. But really the issue that people should be thinking about and that the court should be thinking about is whether these organizations have special license to discriminate when providing services on the government's behalf, justified by their religious beliefs. And I think the answer to that is no.
Hey, Patrick, I feel like I quizzed your colleague for the last 15 minutes or so. Did she pass? Was that all right?
She did great, much better than I would have done.
Well, I actually had a question for Patrick about this particular issue. And so besides just discriminating, well, I guess that is the big issue. So I don't know how much you're watching. I hate to put you on the spot because I didn't give you a heads up on this, but like Samaritan's Purse up in New York City right now, if they are or aren't getting government money, but let's hypothetically say something like Samaritan is getting government money to provide relief in central. Like what else might religious contractors be doing with public funds that they receive?
I'll have to confess I'm not familiar with Samaritan's Purse, so it's difficult to answer.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I was just thinking that things they do is they make their volunteers statement of faith. In that statement of faith, that you have to affirm that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that's for the doctors and the nurses that volunteer with them. And there's been a big controversy in New York. A lot of the people who get sick are scared to receive their care from Samaritan's Purse because they worry about discrimination. So anyway, we can move on. I mean, I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that. I just, I know that's a thing I've been reading about. And if one of the things I think to watch in this case is what all else might religious contractors start doing with public funds if this case comes out a certain way.
Yeah, Americans United is worried about that sort of discrimination, and I might even suggest that it ties into the ministerial exception issue. If religious hospitals try to classify doctors or other professionals who have taken these oaths of religious faith, or however they phrase them, might they also try to say, well, those are ministers? We don't know.
All right. Yeah, I need to look at. Anyway, go ahead. We'll move on. But there was Senate Bill 17 last session that had to do with occupational licenses, and so there's an interim study being done on it as we speak at the Texas legislature, and it is certain to come back next session. So anyway, just a thing to kind of put on some national folks' radar.
So a couple of things, speaking of being on the radar, just a couple of things I want to ask y'all about that we should be watching for. On the national level, are there any executive actions that we should be closely monitoring or filing comments on?
So I'll point out one thing to watch. I think the comment period on this is probably closed, but it certainly ties right in to this idea of faith-based social service providers. In January, the Trump administration proposed a series of new rules about the role and rights of faith-based organizations in being able to provide social services. Just faith-based regulations, I think Googling that would get you there. And what do? They do things like the proposed rules, that is, eliminating requirements that faith-based providers take steps to refer people to alternative providers if they're uncomfortable receiving services at the faith-based provider. They eliminate the requirement that the providers provide some kind of written notice of people's religious freedom rights. So in other words, you'll have people receiving services who might not realize that they shouldn't and can't be subjected to coercion or religious proselytization, or that sort of thing when receiving services. The rules basically invite faith-based agencies to request exemptions from generally applicable anti-discrimination laws, and in that way sort of telegraph that the government is going to be willing to grant them. So the rules, they're proposed rules now. I know Americans United submitted comments on them, and we'll see what the Trump administration does in issuing their final rules, which could come out any time. But this is really problematic to say the least. Josh is thinking about various examples of how stuff like this comes up. So, an example that we've talked about, you might have a gay teenager who's homeless and trying to seek assistance at a shelter, and he goes to a government-funded place that is a faith-based provider with anti-LGBTQ views. And under these rules, maybe he doesn't know that that there's somewhere else he can go, which seems like a really kind of a bare minimum thing, to say nothing of the fact that government should not be in the business of funding discrimination of any sort, even when it's doing it through private providers. And so again, government-based organizations, long-standing partnerships, but we need to be, really careful and really vigilant about the ways that some places use the imprimatur of the government and funding to advance discriminatory conduct and views.
And one of the questions our listeners always ask is, what can we do? So I wonder if you have any advice on what Texans of Faith who are interested in these issues can do here at the state level, or to support your work. When you have groups on the other side like Project Blitz who are pushing out model bills and that kind of thing. Anything folks can do?
Yeah, sure. I have to say this will be a very sort of soft answer. Coming from someone who's building a career in litigation, it's that sort of thing of like, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's what we do. But no, it's a great question and a really important question, especially considering the state of that everyone of faith wants the government to sort of be weaponizing religion. So just basically to make it known that lots of people of faith actually don't want that. You have politicians advocating policies and saying, we're a Christian nation, and claim to be speaking for all people of faith, that are actually speaking for a really narrow minority view. And so to the extent that we can be, supporters and listeners can be, loud and vocal, that there are actually lots and lots of people of faith whose religion, dictates that, whose values include not harming others, and ensuring a country where people can hew to the dictates of their own beliefs or not. And so I, just to bring it back to the amicus briefs that we've worked on together, that's why we think, or part of the reason why we think it's so powerful to serve up our arguments to the Supreme Court with a really broad base of interfaith leaders, an interfaith coalition, to say that, hey, it's a lot of us, and it's people of faith who share these positions and beliefs, and it's not the sort of monolith that some would have you believe. So that's my sort of non-answer answer.
No, I think that was great, and as somebody who's the outreach director for an interfaith organization, we certainly appreciate the work that you're doing each and every day, and the ability to partner with you. Josh, anything you'd add on that?
No, just thank you to our partners at AAU for the work that you do, the opportunity to sign on amicus and being able to help resource us. I know many times I've had a piece of legislation where I've needed to say as a lawyer, it does X, and it helps to say we've consulted with lawyers, plural, and we all agree that this does X. And I think that's a quite powerful partner to have, and thank you so much for your work.
So
yeah, we're so happy to partner with you.
So where can folks find more information, or is there anything you'd like to shamelessly plug on your end today?
Americans United for Separation of Church and State. You can Google it. I think we're just au.org. Shameful that I don't know that. I think that's right, though. You can find out what we're up to, and not just our litigation efforts, but also what our own public policy team is up to, as well as find out about sort of some of the grassroots advocacy that we do across the states.
Well, Sarah, Patrick, thank you both so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you all making the time, and thank you for the work that you're doing each and every day. It is appreciated.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And Josh, thanks for helping keep us straight today. Appreciate having the attorney in the office to help translate for me. But thank you. It's good seeing you. Good seeing your face online. I miss seeing you in the office. So.
Yes, I haven't seen you in a while. I look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. So friends, thank you for tuning in today, and thanks for the work that you are doing each and every day. This is an important time for Texans of faith and faith leaders to speak up and make your voice heard. Let us know how we can resource you to do that. And if you've made it this far in the program, you obviously appreciate the work of Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community. We hope you'll consider joining and making sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact. You can do that online at texasimpact.org/join. Friends, these are anxious times and the world needs you. Let's get to work.